They called her the spinster of Alder Gulch, a woman with a scarred cheek and a spirit too wild for parlor rooms. When the town auctioned her off to settle a debt, only one man bid, a terrifying, scarred mountain man. But Abigail knew something he didn't. She knew horses. The dust of Virginia City, Montana Territory, in the sweltering July of 1868, tasted like pulverized bone and broken promises. It coated the boardwalks, settled into the deep lines of the miners' faces, and choked the life out of everything it touched. Everything, that is, except Josiah Caldwell's ambition. Abigail Lawson stood on the rough-hewn planks outside the territorial magistrate's office, her hands bound tightly in front of her by a length of coarse hemp rope. It was a crude, humiliating gesture, an absolute theatrical display of dominance orchestrated by Caldwell himself. At 26, Abigail was considered an old maid by the harsh standards of the frontier. She was tall, lean as a whipcord, with hands calloused from years of gripping leather reins and a long, jagged scar that slashed across her left cheekbone, a lasting memento from a terrified Mustang she had tried to gentle when she was just 14. The townsfolk of Alder Gulch didn't look at her with pity. They looked at her with a mixture of disdain and apprehension. She didn't sew, she didn't gossip, and she certainly didn't flutter her eyelashes at the eligible bachelors. Abigail lived for the remuda. She knew the secret language of the equine soul, possessing a profound, almost supernatural ability to read the twitch of an ear, the flare of a nostril, and the shifting weight of a 1,000-pound beast. But horse sense couldn't pay off a banknote. 2 weeks prior, her father, Thomas Lawson, had been found dead by the banks of the Ruby River. The local physician, a man who spent more time at the bottom of a whiskey bottle than in medical texts, declared it a heart failure. Abigail knew better. Her father had been an expert horse breeder, raising the finest, most resilient Appaloosas in the territory horses that could run all day on sparse bunchgrass and navigate treacherous shale slopes without slipping. Caldwell, the wealthiest cattle baron in the valley, had wanted that prime grazing land and those bloodlines for years. Thomas had repeatedly refused to sell. Now, Thomas was in the ground, and Caldwell had miraculously produced a promissory note, allegedly signed by Thomas, offering the entire ranch and its livestock as collateral for a massive, unpayable debt. Judge Ezekiel Hopkins, a man whose gavel was effectively owned by Caldwell's payroll, stood on the makeshift auction block. A crowd of miners, ranch hands, and saloon girls had gathered, eager for the morning's cruel entertainment. "Hear ye! Hear ye!" Judge Hopkins bellowed, wiping sweat from his red, bulbous nose. "By order of the territorial court, the estate of the late Thomas Lawson is hereby seized to satisfy the debts owed to Mr. Josiah Caldwell. However, the debt far exceeds the value of the dirt and the beasts. The law of this territory dictates that the debtor's kin must make amends." Caldwell stepped forward, his thumbs hooked confidently into the pockets of his tailored broadcloth vest. He was a handsome man in a serpentine way, his smile never quite reaching his cold, slate-gray eyes. "I am a reasonable man, Judge," Caldwell announced to the crowd, projecting his voice. "I don't wish to see a destitute orphan woman thrown into the wilderness. I will forgive the remainder of the debt to any man who will take this woman as his lawful wedded wife and assume responsibility for her upkeep. Think of it as a charity auction." Laughter rippled through the dusty crowd. Abigail kept her chin high, her dark eyes blazing with a suppressed, lethal fury. She looked at the faces in the crowd: Levi, the blacksmith, who had once bought a mare from her father; Cora, the seamstress, who had gossiped about Abigail's scar for years. None of them met her gaze. They were cowards, every last one of them. "Do I hear a bid?" Judge Hopkins chuckled, banging his gavel lightly against the rail. "Any man brave enough to take on the spinster of Alder Gulch? She ain't pretty, boys, but she's got a strong back. Good for scrubbing pots, if you can keep a sack over her head." More laughter erupted. "I'll give you a plug nickel, Judge," yelled a drunken miner from the back, "but she's got to sleep in the barn." Abigail felt a hot tear of profound humiliation prick the corner of her eye, but she forced it back down. She would rather die than let Josiah Caldwell see her cry. She knew exactly what Caldwell was doing. No one would bid on her. Once she was declared entirely destitute and a ward of the territory, Caldwell would quietly have her shipped off to an asylum in the East, or worse, leaving him with uncontested claim to the Lawson bloodlines. Going once, Hopkins drawled, relishing the spectacle. Going twice, 50 ounces of yellow dust. The voice did not shout, yet it cut through the dusty, murmuring air like the crack of a bullwhip. It was a voice that sounded like grinding stones and deep winter ice. The crowd parted, as if physically shoved. Stepping out from the shadows of the livery stable awning was a man who looked like he had been carved directly from the unforgiving granite of the Bitterroot Mountains. He was impossibly tall, broad-shouldered, and clad entirely in grease-stained, smoked buckskins that smelled faintly of pine resin and old blood. A thick, untamed mane of dark hair and a heavy beard obscured most of his face, leaving only a pair of piercing, pale blue eyes visible beneath the brim of a battered slouch hat. A massive, bone-handled hunting knife was strapped to his thigh, and he cradled a long-barreled Hawken Plains rifle in the crook of his arm as naturally as a mother holds a child. This was Jeremiah Boone. The townspeople whispered stories about him around campfires. They called him Grizzly Boone. He lived high up in the impassable peaks, trapping furs and trading only twice a year. Rumor had it he had killed 3 men with his bare hands in a dispute over a trapline, and that he survived the brutal winters by eating raw wolf meat. Jeremiah stepped up to the auction block, his heavy leather moccasins making no sound on the dusty street. He reached into his hunting pouch and pulled out 2 heavy leather drawstring bags. He tossed them onto the judge's podium. They hit the wood with a heavy, indisputable thud. 50 ounces of pure placer gold, Jeremiah repeated, his gaze fixed solely on the terrified judge. That settles the man's debt. And I'm taking the woman and the horses. Josiah Caldwell's smug smile instantly vanished, replaced by an ugly scowl. Now see here, mountaineer, Caldwell snapped, stepping toward Jeremiah. The horses are collateral. The gold only covers the woman's outstanding. Jeremiah didn't even turn his head. He simply shifted the Hawken rifle ever so slightly, the heavy octagonal barrel pointing downward but perfectly positioned to swing up and tear Caldwell in half. I read the magistrate's posting, Jeremiah said softly. It was a terrifying quietness. The estate is seized for debt. I am paying the debt in full. Therefore, the estate, the land, the beasts, and the woman belongs to me. Unless you're calling me a liar, Caldwell? Caldwell swallowed hard, looking at the scarred, missing ring finger on Jeremiah's left hand as it rested near the rifle's trigger guard. The cattle baron took a slurpia, calculated step back. The law is the law, Caldwell muttered, looking furiously at the judge. Judge Hopkins scrambled to open the heavy leather pouches, his eyes widening at the sight of the glittering dust. Sold! He squeaked, bringing the gavel down rapidly. Debt settled! The marriage will be recorded forthwith. Jeremiah turned to Abigail. He didn't smile, he didn't gloat. He simply reached out with his large, calloused hand, drew a hunting knife from his belt with lightning speed, and sliced the rough hemp rope binding her wrists. Get your things, Jeremiah said, his voice flat. We ride for the high country in an hour. Abigail rubbed her chafed wrists, staring up into the terrifying, bearded face of her new owner. She had just traded a corrupt cattle baron for a feral mountain man. But as she looked into those pale blue eyes, she didn't see the cruelty she had expected. She saw a vast, unfathomable emptiness, a deep isolation that mirrored her own. The journey out of the Gallatin Valley and toward the foothills of the Bitterroots was an exercise in brutal, punishing silence. Abigail rode her only remaining personal possession, a sturdy, intelligent bay mare named Nutmeg. Behind her trailed a string of 6 magnificent Appaloosa horses, the very best of her father's breeding stock, which she had hastily gathered from the hidden canyon corral before Caldwell's men could find them. Jeremiah Boone led the procession, riding a monstrous, foul-tempered black mule he called Samson. For 3 days they pushed upward into the timberline. The air grew thinner, carrying the sharp, biting scent of spruce and impending snow, even in the height of summer. The terrain shifted from rolling sagebrush hills to jagged, perilous scree slopes and dense, shadowing pine forests. Abigail waited for the abuse. She waited for the mountain man to make his demands, to claim his rights as the husband who had purchased her like a sack of winter flour. She slept with a small, sharp farrier's knife hidden beneath her wool blanket, fully prepared to gut him if he crept near her fire. But Jeremiah never did. He established camp with brutal efficiency. He hunted, providing fresh venison and grouse, which he cooked silently over the smokeless fires he built. He offered her the best cuts of meat on a tin plate, never speaking more than a dozen words a day. Eat. We cross the river now. Keep the horses tight on this ridge. On the fourth afternoon, the tension between them finally broke, not with words, but with blood and dust. They were navigating a narrow, treacherous switchback along the edge of a plunging canyon when they heard it, a shrill, terrifying scream of pure equine panic. Abigail kicked Nutmeg forward, pushing past Jeremiah's massive mule. Up ahead, in a small rocky clearing bordered by a steep drop-off, a wild blue roan stallion was trapped. The beast was magnificent, 16 hands high, heavily muscled, with a coat the color of a bruised thunderhead. But he was caught. His front left hoof was wedged deep into a cruel, jagged fissure in the granite rock. In his blind panic to escape, the stallion had thrashed wildly, scraping the skin from his foreleg, white lather covering his chest as he screamed and pulled, risking snapping his own cannon bone. Jeremiah dismounted swiftly, pulling his heavy Hawken rifle from its scabbard. "He's done for," the mountain man grunted, checking the percussion cap. "Legs probably shattered, or it will be in a minute. Best to put him out of his misery before he draws a cougar down on us." He raised the rifle to his shoulder, taking aim at the space between the thrashing stallion's terrified eyes. "No!" Abigail threw herself off Nutmeg, sprinting directly into the line of fire. She stood between the enormous mountain man and the panicking wild horse. Her arms spread wide. "Move, woman," Jeremiah growled, lowering the rifle an inch, his eyes flashing with sudden, dangerous anger. "That beast is out of its mind with pain. It will trample you to pulp." "You don't know horses," Abigail shouted back, her voice echoing off the canyon walls. The scar on her cheek flushed angry red. "He isn't broken yet. Just trapped. Give me your rope. Now!" Jeremiah stared at her. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind whistling through the pines and the frantic, exhausted gasps of the trapped roan. He saw the fierce, unyielding fire in Abigail's dark eyes. With a slow, deliberate motion, he uncoiled the heavy lariat from his saddle horn and tossed it to the dirt at her feet. "Your funeral, Mrs. Boone," he muttered darkly, stepping back, keeping the rifle ready. Abigail ignored him. She picked up the rope, but instead of moving aggressively toward the horse, she dropped her shoulders. She slowed her breathing. She began to hum a low, rhythmic, vibrating tune her father had taught her, a sound that mimicked the steady, reassuring heartbeat of a mare. She approached the blue roan on an angle, never looking directly into its eyes, which a horse perceives as a predatory challenge. She moved with agonizing slowness. "Easy, boy," she murmured, her voice a soft, continuous drone. "Easy. Thunder. I know it hurts. I know you're scared." The stallion reared back as far as his trapped hoof would allow, his hooves striking the air, eyes rolling white. Jeremiah raised his rifle again, certain the woman was about to be beaten to death. But Abigail didn't flinch. She stopped, holding her ground, continuing to hum. Slowly, she extended her hand, palm down. She waited. Minutes ticked by, like hours. The stallion's frantic thrashing slowed, the whites of his eyes diminished. He was exhausted, shivering violently in the cool mountain air. Abigail took another step, then another, until she was close enough to feel the heat radiating from the massive animal. She gently laid her hand on his muscular neck. The horse flinched violently, but Abigail maintained the steady, reassuring pressure, sliding her hand up to his withers, finding the exact pressure points that triggered release in the equine nervous system. With her other hand, she deftly fashioned a simple hackamore out of the lariat, slipping it over the horse's nose and behind its ears with the speed of a striking snake. "Hold steady," she whispered. She dropped to her knees right beside the trapped, deadly hooves. Jeremiah held his breath. One kick would take her head clean off. Abigail inspected the fissure. The hoof wasn't broken. It was wedged by a sharp piece of loose shale. Using the handle of her hidden farrier's knife, she wedged it against the rock and hammered it with a loose stone. With a sharp crack, the shale splintered. "Back!" Abigail commanded sharply, pulling the hackamore rope. The blue roan stumbled backward, its hoof pulling free from the crevice. The horse let out a massive, shuddering breath, standing on 3 legs, favoring the scraped limb. It looked down at the tiny, scarred woman holding its lead rope. It didn't bolt, it didn't attack, it simply lowered its massive head and nudged her shoulder. Abigail turned to look at Jeremiah. She was covered in dust and horse lather, breathing heavily, but her eyes were triumphant. Jeremiah slowly lowered his rifle. He had spent his entire life in the wilderness. He knew the violence of nature, the uncompromising brutality of survival. He had never, in his 38 years, seen someone conquer a wild, terrified beast using nothing but patience and empathy. He walked over to her, his heavy boots crunching on the stone. He looked at the horse, then down at Abigail. He reached out, and for a terrifying second, Abigail thought he was going to strike her. Instead, his rough, calloused fingers gently brushed a streak of dirt from her scarred cheek. "I bought a bride to satisfy the homesteading requirements down in the valley," Jeremiah said quietly, his voice devoid of its usual harsh gravel. "I thought I was buying a housekeeper. It seems I bought a witch." "I am a horseman, Mr. Boone," Abigail said proudly, holding the lead rope tight. "The best in this territory." Jeremiah looked at the string of fine Appaloosas, then at the wild roan she had just claimed, and finally back to her. The corner of his mouth twitched upward beneath his thick beard. It was the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him. "I believe you are, Abigail. Come on. The cabin is just over the ridge." Jeremiah's cabin sat in a secluded, emerald valley completely hidden from the lower plains. A crystal-clear creek fed by snowmelt wound through rich, knee-high meadow grass, flanked by towering walls of granite and thick stands of lodgepole pine. The cabin itself was a marvel of frontier engineering. Thick, interlocking logs chinked with clay, heavy wooden shutters to keep out winter storms and hungry bears, and a massive stone hearth that radiated warmth. Over the next month, a strange, beautiful rhythm developed between the mountain man and the outcast bride. Abigail didn't scrub floors or darn socks all day. Instead, Jeremiah helped her fell timber to construct a massive, sturdy corral in the meadow. She took over the management of the livestock. She treated the blue roan, whom she named Brimstone, poulticing his leg with pine pitch and yarrow until he was sound. She began gentling the Appaloosas, training them to saddle not through the traditional, brutal breaking methods of tying them to a post and beating them into submission, but through pressure, release, and profound mutual respect. Jeremiah, the solitary predator of the mountains, found himself captivated. He would return from checking his trap lines or hunting elk, lean against the top rail of the corral, and watch her work. He watched the way her scarred face softened when she spoke to the horses. He watched the confident, fluid way she moved, completely fearless among the massive animals. In the evenings, sitting by the fire, the silence between them was no longer oppressive. It was comfortable. The walls they had built around themselves out of necessity were slowly crumbling. One evening, as Abigail sat by the hearth oiling a bridle, Jeremiah walked over and dropped something in her lap. She picked it up. It was a beautiful, intricately carved hair comb, fashioned from smooth, polished elk antler. "Your hair is always in your face when you work the roan," Jeremiah muttered, suddenly looking very interested in the fire. Abigail stared at the comb, her fingers tracing the delicate etchings of mountain columbines he had carved into the bone. A lump formed in her throat. No one had ever made something beautiful just for her. "Thank you, Jeremiah," she whispered. He nodded once, roughly. "You've made this place different. Better. The horses, they bring life to this dead valley." He paused, looking at her intently. "You have a gift, Abby." It was the first time he had used the nickname. It sent a warm flutter through her chest. But the peace of their high-altitude sanctuary was a fragile illusion, and down in the valley, the poison of Virginia City was beginning to boil over. Josiah Caldwell had not forgotten his humiliation at the auction block. Worse, he had finally realized exactly what Abigail had stolen from him. When he had ridden out to the Lawson Ranch to take inventory of his newly acquired assets, he found the stables empty. Abigail hadn't just taken her father's horses. She had taken the foundation sires and the prime breeding mares. Those Appaloosas were worth thousands of dollars to the U.S. cavalry, who were desperate for tough mounts in the Indian Wars. Caldwell realized that the scarred spinster had outsmarted him completely. Furious, Caldwell sent to Bozeman for a man named Wyatt Three Fingers Dempsey. Dempsey wasn't a cattle rustler. He was a murderer who specialized in making problems disappear in the vast, unpoliced territories. Caldwell paid Dempsey a heavy bag of gold double eagles. The instructions were simple: track the mountain man, kill him, kill the woman, and bring the Appaloosas back to the valley. Autumn came early to the Bitterroots. The quaking aspens turned a violent, brilliant gold, and the morning air snapped with frost. Abigail was out in the meadow, leading Brimstone on a long line, marveling at how the massive blue roan responded to her slightest cluck and shift in body weight. Jeremiah was high up on the northern ridge, scouting for winter elk herds. The first sign of trouble wasn't a sound, but a scent. Brimstone suddenly stopped dead. His ears pricked sharply forward, swiveling like radar dishes toward the narrow southern pass that led down to the valley. The horse flared his nostrils, inhaling deeply, and let out a low, nervous snort. He began to prance, pulling at the lead line. Abigail frowned. She closed her eyes and inhaled. The wind was blowing up from the valley. Beneath the scent of pine needles and damp earth, she caught it. Wood smoke, but not sweet pine smoke. It was the acrid, harsh smell of green wood burning a careless fire. And beneath that, the faint, metallic tang of unwashed bodies and chewing tobacco. A chill that had nothing to do with the autumn frost crawled down Abigail's spine. She tied Brimstone securely to the corral rail and ran toward the southern edge of the meadow where the trees grew thickest. She dropped to her hands and knees, creeping to the edge of the creek where the mud was soft. There, perfectly preserved in the damp clay, was a fresh boot print. It had a star-shaped spur mark in the heel. Jeremiah wore moccasins. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. They weren't alone in the valley, and whoever was out there was hiding, watching the cabin. A shadow fell over her. Abigail spun around, gasping, her hand flying to the hidden knife in her skirt. Jeremiah stood there, his face like carved granite, his pale eyes burning with a terrifying, cold light. He had his Hawken rifle in one hand, and in the other he held a dead, half-smoked cigar he had found crushed into the moss. "Get to the cabin, Abby," Jeremiah whispered, his voice deadly and quiet. "Bar the heavy shutters. Do not come out, no matter what you hear." "Jeremiah, what is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How many?" "I cut the tracks of 5 men coming up the pass," he said, checking the percussion cap on his rifle. "They spread out in the timber. They aren't hunters. They're moving like wolves. Caldwell sent them for the horses. And for you." "I won't leave you out here alone," Abigail insisted, gripping his heavy leather sleeve. "I can shoot. Give me a pistol." Jeremiah looked down at her. He reached out and cupped her scarred cheek, his rough thumb brushing the skin with surprising tenderness. "You gentled the horses, Abby," he said softly. "But some things in this world can't be gentled. They just need to be killed." He turned and melted into the dense pine forest, without making a single sound, leaving Abigail alone as the first dark clouds of a coming storm rolled violently over the jagged mountain peaks. The heavy oak bar dropped across the cabin door with a resounding thud that seemed to shake the very foundations of the structure. Abigail stood in the center of the dim room, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped wild bird. Outside, the autumn sky bruised purple and black, unleashing a torrential downpour of freezing rain that pelted the heavy wooden shutters like a handful of gravel thrown by an angry ghost. The wind howled down the chimney, sending puffs of gray ash into the room, but Abigail barely noticed the cold. She walked over to the heavy wooden table where Jeremiah had left his secondary weapon, a massive, iron-framed Colt Dragoon revolver, a relic from the Mexican War, heavy enough to drop a charging grizzly. She checked the percussion caps with trembling, yet practiced, fingers. Her father had taught her how to shoot, insisting that a woman living on the edge of the Bozeman Trail needed to know how to defend her livestock. But shooting at tin cans on a fence post was vastly different from shooting at men who killed for Caldwell's gold. Out in the blinding sheet of freezing rain, Jeremiah Boone became a phantom. The heavy, grease-soaked buckskins that made him look like a savage in town now rendered him entirely waterproof and virtually invisible in the dense, shadowy timber of his domain. He moved with a terrifying, liquid grace, making absolutely no sound over the roar of the mountain storm. He found the first man easily, The fool was huddled beneath the dripping branches of a massive blue spruce, trying in vain to shield the paper cartridge of his Sharp's carbine from the rain. He was a low-level rustler from the Gallatin Valley known as Curly Jenkins. Jeremiah didn't waste powder. He materialized from the shadows behind the trunk, his thick, scarred forearm wrapping around the man's throat in a vice grip, while his bone-handled knife found the soft spot just beneath the ribs. The man slumped silently into the wet pine needles, joining the earth. But Wyatt Three Fingers Dempsey was not a common rustler. He was a seasoned predator, a ruthless survivor of the border wars, and he knew better than to walk blindly into a mountain man's sanctuary. When Dempsey heard nothing from his flanker, he signaled his remaining 3 men to halt. They communicated with sharp, hand-cut gestures. Dempsey realized the frontal assault on the cabin was a suicide mission. The mountaineer was picking them off in the brush. Dempsey pivoted his strategy. He pointed his revolver not toward the smoking chimney of the cabin, but toward the sprawling wooden corral down in the meadow. The horses. Caldwell was paying for the girl and the man dead. But the true prize, the fortune, was the Appaloosa breeding stock. If they stole the horses, the man and the woman would eventually freeze or starve, or be forced down into the valley where Caldwell's deputies were waiting. Inside the cabin, Abigail paced the floorboards. The absolute silence from the woods was far more terrifying than the crack of gunfire. She moved to the rear window, unlatching the heavy iron hook and cracking the shutter open just a fraction of an inch to peer out into the gloom. The corral was barely visible through the driving sleet. Suddenly, a flash of lightning illuminated the meadow. In that brilliant, stark white second, Abigail's blood ran colder than the mountain rain. 3 men were at the corral. One was using a heavy set of iron snips to cut through the thick rawhide lashings of the gate. They weren't trying to breach the cabin. They were taking her father's legacy. She saw Brimstone, the massive blue roan, rearing up in panic, his hooves thrashing the air, sensing the predatory intent of the intruders. The Appaloosa mares were squealing in terror, bunching up against the far rails. "No," Abigail whispered, her grip tightening on the heavy Colt Dragoon. Jeremiah had told her to stay barred inside. It was the logical, safe thing to do. But those horses were the last living connection to her father. They represented her life, her struggle, and the only leverage she had in a world that had tried to throw her away. She was not the spinster of Alder Gulch hiding in the shadows anymore. Abigail shoved the heavy revolver into the waistband of her woolen skirt. She didn't use the front door. It would make too much noise. Instead, she slipped through the narrow gap of the back window, dropping softly into the freezing mud behind the woodshed. The rain instantly soaked through her clothes, chilling her to the bone, but the adrenaline pumping fiercely through her veins kept her moving. She used the natural dip of the creek bed to conceal her approach, crawling through the freezing knee-high water until she was within 30 yards of the corral. She could hear the men cursing loudly, slipping in the mud as they tried to throw ropes over the panicked mares. "Grab the roan, you idiot," a harsh, gravelly voice barked over the wind. It was Dempsey. He's the lead. The spotted mares will follow him out of the valley. A burly outlaw with a thick mustache climbed the top rail, a lariat swinging in his hand. He prepared to drop the loop over Brimstone's neck. Abigail knew she couldn't outshoot 3 heavily armed men in the pouring rain, but she knew horses better than any man breathing. She rose from the creek bed, the freezing wind whipping her wet hair across her scarred face. She placed 2 fingers in her mouth and blew. It was not a normal whistle. It was a sharp, vibrating, high-pitched screech, a sound her father had explicitly trained the lead horses to recognize as an absolute, immediate predator warning. To the Appaloosas, it was the sound of a cougar dropping from the branches. Chaos erupted instantly. Brimstone didn't just rear, he exploded forward with the force of a locomotive. He crashed directly into the wooden gate just as the outlaw threw his rope. The heavy timber splintered, and the burly man was thrown backward into the mud, screaming as the roan's heavy hooves narrowly missed crushing his skull. The 6 Appaloosa mares, triggered by the warning whistle and the stallion's violent break, surged through the shattered gate in a terrifying, chaotic stampede of muscle and flying mud. "Shoot the beasts!" Dempsey roared, drawing his revolver, realizing he had lost control of the situation. "Hey!" Abigail screamed, stepping completely out of the creek bed, raising the heavy Colt Dragoon with both hands. Dempsey spun around, his eyes locking onto the soaked, scarred woman standing boldly in the downpour. A cruel, ugly smile twisted his face. "Well, looky here, boys," Dempsey shouted over the storm. Caldwell said the freak was ugly, but he didn't say she was stupid enough to come out and die. Dempsey raised his six-shooter, aiming squarely at Abigail's chest. He thumbed back the hammer. The crack of thunder masked the sound of the gunshot, but Abigail saw the muzzle flash from Dempsey's weapon tear through the gray rain. The bullet tore viciously through the heavy wool of her sleeve, grazing her shoulder with a burn like hot iron. She staggered backward, splashing into the shallow mud of the creek, gasping in sudden, breathless pain. "Grab her!" Dempsey yelled to his remaining man, a tall, wiry killer named Silas, who was scrambling to his feet from the mud. "Caldwell wants proof she's done!" Abigail scrambled backward, her hands slick with freezing rain and her own warm blood. She raised the heavy Colt, trying to steady the iron sights, but the gun was incredibly heavy, and her left arm was screaming in agony. Silas charged toward her, splashing through the creek, a long, curved hunting knife drawn and glinting in the dim light. Suddenly, a massive, dark shadow detached itself from the tree line. Jeremiah Boone did not yell. He did not issue a warning. He simply crashed into Silas with the unstoppable, brutal force of a falling redwood. The two men rolled into the freezing creek water. Silas managed to slash upward with his knife, tearing a gash across Jeremiah's ribs, but the mountain man didn't even flinch. With a sickening crunch that echoed loudly over the rain, Jeremiah drove his heavy knee downward, instantly incapacitating the rustler. Dempsey, realizing the terrifying legends of the mountain man were entirely true, panicked. He turned his weapon away from Abigail and fired twice at Jeremiah. The bullet skipped violently off the rocks in the creek bed, throwing shards of stone into the air. Jeremiah rose from the water, his eyes burning with a primal, lethal fury. He didn't bother raising his hawk and rifle. The powder was likely wet from the river tackle. Instead, he pulled the massive, bone-handled hunting knife from his thigh sheath. Dempsey began backing away quickly toward the narrow valley pass, his hands shaking as he desperately tried to cock the hammer of his revolver for another shot. "Stay back, mountain man," Dempsey screamed, his voice cracking with genuine terror. "Caldwell owns this whole territory. You kill me, he'll send 50 men up this mountain." "Let them come," Jeremiah growled, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that carried over the storm. He stepped out of the water, stalking toward the killer. Dempsey fired his last round. The bullet clipped the edge of Jeremiah's shoulder, tearing through the buckskin, but the massive man merely rolled his shoulder and continued his relentless, silent advance. Dempsey dropped the empty revolver, cursing wildly, and turned to run blindly for the tree line. He didn't make it 3 steps. A massive slate-gray wall of muscle suddenly blocked his path. It was Brimstone. The blue roan stallion hadn't fled with the mares. He had circled back, drawn by Abigail's distress. The horse lowered his massive head, his ears pinned flat against his skull in absolute equine fury, and lashed out with his front hooves. The heavy iron shoe caught Dempsey squarely in the chest, lifting the killer entirely off his feet and throwing him 10 yards backward into the thick mud. He landed with a heavy, lifeless thud and did not move again. The sudden silence in the valley was deafening, save for the patter of the dying rain. Jeremiah stood over Dempsey's broken body for a long moment, ensuring the threat was entirely eliminated. Then, he dropped his knife into the mud and turned frantically, his pale eyes searching the riverbank. He found Abigail sitting up in the shallow water, clutching her bleeding shoulder, shivering violently from the cold and the shock. Jeremiah dropped to his knees in the freezing mud beside her. The terrifying, stoic mountain man was gone, replaced by a man looking at the only light he had ever found in his dark world. His large, calloused hands trembled as he gently pulled her heavy, soaked wool collar aside to inspect the wound. "It's just a graze," Abigail managed to whisper, her teeth chattering loudly. She looked up at his terrifying, bearded face, seeing the deep, agonizing fear in his pale blue eyes, fear for her. "I told you to stay inside," Jeremiah said, his voice cracking, completely devoid of its usual harsh gravel. He pulled her against his broad chest, burying his face in her wet hair, wrapping his massive arms around her to share his body heat. Dear God, Abby, I thought I was too late. I thought I lost you." Abigail rested her head against his chest, listening to the frantic, heavy beating of his heart. The fear and humiliation of Alder Gulch felt 1,000,000 miles away. "I couldn't let them take the horses, Jeremiah. and I couldn't let them kill my husband. Jeremiah pulled back slightly, looking deeply into her dark eyes. He raised his hand, gently tracing the long, jagged scar across her cheek, not with pity, but with profound reverence. "You are the bravest thing in this entire territory, Abigail Boone," he whispered, before leaning down and pressing his mouth firmly against hers, a promise sealed in rain and blood. By the time the snows melted the following spring, the world below the Bitterroots had drastically changed. Word of Wyatt Dempsey's demise at the hands of a mountain man reached the federal authorities in Bozeman. Deputy Marshal Harrison, a man who harbored a long-standing hatred for Josiah Caldwell's corrupt reign, rode into Alder Gulch with a warrant and a dozen armed deputies. Caldwell, stripped of his hired muscle and his aura of invincibility, was dragged from his luxurious parlor in irons, charged with conspiracy to commit murder and grand theft. His vast cattle empire fractured, sold off piece by piece at auction. High up in the hidden Emerald Valley, life thrived. The morning sun broke warm and bright over the granite peaks, illuminating the sprawling corral where Abigail Boone leaned against the heavy top rail. Her scarred cheek caught the golden light as she smiled. Inside the enclosure, Brimstone proudly stood watch over a wobbly, knock-kneed newborn foal, its coat already showing the striking, beautiful spots of the Appaloosa bloodline. Jeremiah walked up behind her, carrying 2 steaming tin cups of chicory coffee. He wrapped a strong arm around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. They didn't need to speak. The spinster of Alder Gulch was gone forever. She was the matriarch of the high country now, the woman who had tamed wild beasts and a wilder man, building a legendary legacy of love and resilience where no one else had dared to look. Did you enjoy this tale of untamed wilderness and unexpected love? The frontier is full of untold stories where outcasts become legends and broken hearts find their true home. If you want to hear more thrilling, real-life, Wild West romance dramas filled with dangerous outlaws, rugged mountain men, and the fierce women who tame them, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel right now. Don't miss our next incredible journey into the West.
Hi, my name is Royal Trials, the owner and manager of Royal Trials. After watching the video, a woman was left for dead in the desert sun. The mountain man found her before the buzzards did. I'd really like to know what you think. How did the story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the feeling of desperation slowly turning into hope. The woman had clearly been abandoned in the harshest possible situation, and the mountain man stepping in when no one else would made the story feel deeply human. Beneath his rough exterior, there was a quiet sense of compassion that changed everything for her. Do you think he understood her pain because he had experienced loneliness himself? And what moment in the story affected you the most? I think stories like this remind us that sometimes a single act of kindness at the right moment can completely change the direction of someone's life. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy emotional mountain stories with heart, feel free to like and subscribe to Royal Trials for more.
Hi, my name is William Sunny, the owner and manager of Iron Cowboy Gardena. After watching the video, father sent his A mountain man got the bride nobody wanted. She knew more about horses than any man in the territory. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the feeling of being underestimated and then proving everyone wrong. Abigail was judged by her appearance, her scar, and the expectations of the people around her, yet she carried a remarkable gift and strength that few could see. Watching her earn respect through patience, skill, and intelligence made this story both inspiring and heartfelt. One lesson I took away is that people often have talents and qualities that aren't obvious at first glance. Sometimes the person others overlook is the one with the most to offer. What moment made you admire Abigail the most? And did your opinion of Jeremiah change as their relationship grew throughout the story? In everyday life, it might be worth taking a little extra time to look beyond first impressions and appreciate what makes people unique. You never know what strength someone may be carrying beneath the surface. Thank you for spending time with us today. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy these mountain man stories, feel free to like the video or subscribe to Iron Cowboy Gardena for more stories of resilience, courage, and unexpected connection.